This is part 1 of a video on how to inspect and adjust valve clearance on a 2011 Ninja 250. We're going to show every step in detail, starting with removing the right fairing. In order to remove the right fairing, we must first remove the right side cover. There is one Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. Keep your hardware in an organizer to prevent loss. This is a very inexpensive DeWalt organizer purchased at Home Depot. It is compact and has 2 halves, one used for the right fairing hardware and the other for the left fairing hardware. The dividers can be repositioned. Now we will remove the second large hex bolt located at the middle of the bike. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab on the connector. You may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And there are 2 more hex bolts at the front of the bike, which are screwed into well nuts. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it is removed from its threads. Keep track of the nut plate. Sometimes the nut plate will be clamped on tightly, other times it will fall off. This is what the nut plate looks like. The bolt screws in like so. If the plate does fall off, be sure to keep it in your organizer. There are 3 small rivets. To remove the side fairing, we'll have to remove only the lower 2. We'll remove the 3rd upper rivet later on, when we remove the radiator fairing. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece raised up. Notice that in this configuration the teeth are not flared out, and thus the rivet is not activated. After the rivet is installed, it is activated by pushing the middle piece inward like so. Notice that the teeth are flared out, which means the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, the middle piece is pushed further in like so. Notice that the teeth are not flared out, which means the rivet has been deactivated. To reset the rivet, simply push the middle piece back out. Now the rivet is ready to be installed. Now we will remove the second rivet. Again, the third rivet does not need to be removed until we remove the radiator fairing. There are 3 large rivets at the bottom of the fairings that hold the right and left fairings together. These rivets are designed differently from the small rivets. To remove them, use a flathead screwdriver to take out the inner part of the rivet, and then the remaining part will be easy to free from the hole in the fairings. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece removed. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is deactivated. Once the primary piece is installed in the fairings, the inner piece is pushed into it. Notice that the teeth cannot be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, simply pull the middle piece out with a flathead screwdriver. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inward again, which means that the rivet is deactivated and can easily be removed. Here is the second large rivet. And the third large rivet. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. The 2 hex bolts removed previously screw into them. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. If you're interested in how these well nuts work, here's a diagram. The rubber has metal threading inside it that the bolts screw into. As the bolt rotates in the threads, the end of the well nut moves inward, flaring out the rubber and creating a tight seal on the surface. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. This is where the pad is supposed to be located. You can see the sticker residue. And this is the pad. It protects the gas tank from friction against the fairing. This pad was left uninstalled for thousands of miles. You can see where the fairing has rubbed against the gas tank. Now we will remove the left fairing. Removal of the left fairing is pretty much the same as the right fairing, minus the 3 large rivets at the bottom that hold the 2 fairings together. To remove the left fairing, we must first remove the left side cover. There is 1 Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And 2 more hex bolts near the front of the bike. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it's removed from its threads. The nut plate on this fairing is loose, so it's best to take it off and put it in our organizer so it doesn't get lost. As with the right side fairing, there are 3 small rivets. To remove the side fairing, you will only need to remove the lower 2. The third upper rivet connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing and is not necessary to remove until we remove the radiator fairing. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab. These wires are not easy to detach, so you may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. Now we will remove the radiator fairing. There are 2 Phillips head bolts that connect the radiator fairing with the mounting bracket. There are 2 rivets that connect the radiator fairing with the upper fairing. First, deactivate the rivet by pushing in the center with a pencil or screwdriver. Then the rivet can easily be removed with fingernails. Then remove the radiator fairing by pulling it towards the rear of the bike and then down. Now we're ready to drain the coolant. You may want to put the bike on a rear stand or lift so that it's easier to get under the bike. This is a trackside rear stand purchased at Cycle Gear for about $40 on sale. I'm using spools that screw into the swing arm, but you can also reverse the adapters on the rear stand and use it directly on the swing arm. There are two drain bolts on the Ninja 250 cooling system, one at the water pump and one at the front of the engine. Here are closer views of the two bolts. And even closer views. Don't confuse the water pump drain bolt with the water pump mounting bolts. You'll loosen this bolt, not these bolts. Place a container under the bike. If you're considering buying a drain pan for this job, buy a large one. Unlike oil, coolant is not very viscous and has a tendency to splatter everywhere. Before draining the coolant, we will loosen the radiator cap, but we will not remove it completely. Remember the most important rule: never loosen the radiator cap until the engine has been turned off for at least an hour and has had enough time to cool. When the engine is hot, the coolant vaporizes and creates pressure in the system which can burst out into your eyes, clothes, and/or the motorcycle. The reason we want to loosen the radiator cap before removing the drain bolts is to release any residual pressure in the system, no matter how small, so that coolant doesn't burst out into our eyes or on our pants when loosening the drain bolts, as shown here. If the engine has been off for more than 2 or 3 hours, this probably won't happen, but it's good to get in the habit of loosening the cap, just in case. The reason that you don't want to take the cap off completely is that coolant has a tendency to shoot out of the drain passage uncontrollably when the cap is removed completely, as shown here. Before removing the drain bolts, we will demonstrate how the radiator cap works. After loosening the cap past its first resistance point, we still can't remove the cap. This is a safety feature to protect those who try to remove the cap when the engine is hot. If the engine's hot, the coolant will burst out the sides of the filler neck, but not straight up into your eyes because the coolant will bounce off the cap and spray onto your clothes and/or the motorcycle. Of course, this safety feature only works if your head is above the cap when it's removed. If you're on your knees and your head is level with the filler neck, or if the bike is on a lift and the filler neck is above your head, your eyes could still be sprayed with coolant. To remove the cap completely, we must rotate it past its second resistance point. Then we can remove the cap. There are two valves on the cap. When the system heats up and the coolant expands, the pressure moves this valve inwards and compresses the spring behind it, releasing coolant and the corresponding pressure from the system. Once the coolant and corresponding pressure are released, the spring immediately returns the valve to its resting position, closing the system. The coolant that exits the main system goes into the reserve tank. When the system cools down, this suction valve opens, and the vacuum in the system that was created by the coolant that exited pulls the coolant from the reserve tank back into the system. Don't drop the radiator cap, or else you may damage these parts. When installing the cap, make sure that these two metal folds are positioned on these cutaways on the filler neck. Then turn the cap past its first resistance point, then to its second resistance point until you feel that it stops against the filler neck. Assuming that the cap has not been loosened and the pressure in the system has not been released, We will now proceed to loosen the cap past its first resistance point, but not past its second resistance point. Again, this releases any leftover pressure in the system so that you're not sprayed when you remove the drain bolts. Now we're ready to remove the water pump drain bolt. Notice that the coolant is draining very slowly, to the extent that only drips are observed. This is because the radiator cap has not been removed completely. The washer came out with the bolt. Don't lose the washer. This washer might not be OEM because it looks sort of small, or it may have been accidentally switched with the engine bolt washer. I don't know. Now we're going to let the coolant drain from the system, but because we have a small drain pan, we're going to do it in a way that controls the flow. If you have a big drain pan, or if you're not concerned about creating a mess, you can just remove the radiator cap quickly. But remember, coolant is not only poisonous and corrosive, but also slippery. Wipe off any coolant that splashes onto the tires. Look to the upper left corner to see how lifting the radiator cap allows the coolant to drain. These two shots were taken simultaneously and are synchronized in time. So what you're seeing is the actual effect on the drain flow when lifting up the radiator cap. Rotate the cap past its second resistance point. Remember, we already rotated it past its first resistance point to release the pressure in the system. To prevent a mess and control the flow of the coolant, lift the radiator cap ever so slightly. Again, if you don't care about a mess and want to drain the coolant quickly, you don't have to lift it slowly as seen here. You can just remove it immediately. Now we're going to remove the cap completely, just to show you how this affects the drain flow. As you can see, taking the cap off completely would create quite a mess if you didn't have a large drain pan. It's not easy controlling the flow. The slightest lift of the radiator cap causes the fluid to shoot out uncontrollably. We've now drained most of the coolant from the system. Now we're ready to remove the engine drain bolt. Most likely you'll need a socket extension. The coolant in the engine didn't come out because we have the radiator cap resting on the filler neck. Now I'll remove the radiator cap and you can see the coolant comes rushing out. As you can see, the washer fell onto the engine. Don't lose the washer. To help drain the coolant, put the kickstand down, remove the bike from the rear stand, and tilt it from side to side. The liquid you see here is from a water flush. The liquid you'll see will obviously be more greenish. After letting the coolant drain, put the bike on the rear stand. At this point of the job, set the radiator cap on the filler neck just to make sure that nothing falls into the cooling system. We're now ready to install the drain bolts. We'll start by installing the engine drain bolt with its washer. The coolant change section of the 2011 service manual lists only one torque value for both drain bolts, 87 inch-pounds. Other parts of the manual confirm that the water pump bolt torque value is correct, but in a diagram near the beginning of the engine top-end chapter, and in a table at the beginning of the periodic maintenance chapter, the service manual lists the torque value for the engine drain bolt as only 52 inch-pounds, significantly lower than 87 inch-pounds. To make things more confusing, the engine drain bolt is misnumbered as a muffler bolt in the diagram in the engine top-end chapter, and it's called the water drain bolt instead of the coolant drain bolt, which would seem to me a more accurate name. The 2008 service manual is much more clear and concise. In the main text of its coolant change section, it states clearly that the engine drain bolt should be torqued to 52 inch-pounds and the water pump drain bolt to 87 inch-pounds. But adding to the ambiguity, the climber manual says to torque both bolts to 89 inch-pounds, and climber is usually pretty reliable when it comes to advice on what to do with your bike. The fact that the 2011 service manual neglects the lower torque setting and the climber manual adopts a higher torque setting implies that it would be safer and even recommended to torque the engine drain bolt to a value greater than 52 inch-pounds. I have frequently torqued the engine drain bolt to 87 inch-pounds and it doesn't seem to strip the threads. In this video, I torqued the engine drain bolt to 75 inch-pounds, which is near the middle of the two extremes, but you'll have to decide for yourself. If the bolt falls out while riding, coolant could splash onto the tires and cause the bike to lose traction, whereas if you torque the bolt too much, you could strip the threads in the engine. Again, I'm not sure what torque value would be best, so decide for yourself. Because the smaller bolt goes straight into the engine, it's especially important not to strip the threads. For this reason, I suggest testing the wrench on a bolt that requires a much higher torque value to make sure that the wrench is functioning properly. This foot peg bracket mounting bolt requires 3 times the amount of torque required for the engine drain bolt. You'll need a hex socket and a 1/4 to 3/8 adapter though. It's also a good idea to start at a low torque value, say 50 inch-pounds, and then work up to 75 inch-pounds, or 87 inch-pounds, or whatever value you decide to torque the bolt to. Also, be aware that when using a low torque setting, it's more difficult to feel or hear the clicking noise when the wrench detects the set torque value. To avoid over-torquing, move the wrench very slowly, and listen carefully. This is a $20 1/4 drive Harbor Freight torque wrench. I like it because it's smaller than most torque wrenches and it fits into small places. I have used this wrench for some time now and have had no problems with it. Install the water pump drain bolt with its washer and torque it to 87 inch-pounds or whatever setting is listed in your service manual. Put a drain pan under the coolant reserve tank and remove the hose clamp on the overflow hose. Then remove the hose. Be aware that if your bike is on its side stand, coolant will pour directly onto the engine and create a huge mess. Therefore, make sure that the bike is standing straight up on a rear stand or lift. You can also empty the reserve tank after removing it to avoid splatter, but you will have to hold it at a certain angle or else the coolant will spill out. Every time I drain coolant, I see these little black chips. I'm not sure where they're coming from or whether or not I should be concerned. If anyone has input on this, let me know. Be sure to wipe away any coolant that spilled onto the bottom of the bike so that it doesn't drip onto the tires when riding. Coolant typically spills onto the exhaust pipes and the oil filter bolt. Also, wipe away any coolant that may have spilled or splattered onto the tires. Now we'll remove the coolant reserve tank. Begin by removing the clamp on the vent hose, then remove the hose from its nipple. Take the clamp off the hose so that you can pull it through its bracket. It's hard to see the bracket because it's behind this metal fold. Put the clamp back on the hose so you don't lose it. You can tuck the hose under the gas tank to keep it out of the way. Take the clamp off the overflow hose so that you can pull it through the bracket on the reserve tank. Then put the clamp back on the hose so you don't lose it. This is a good time to wash the coolant off the engine. Remember, coolant is corrosive and can damage painted surfaces. The service manual doesn't mention in its main text that the clutch cable routes through the bracket on the coolant reserve tank and consequently must be pulled through it to remove the tank. Although it does mention this in the routing section of the appendix. We don't have to remove the clutch cable completely, just disconnect the ends so that we can pull the lower end of the cable through the bracket on the reserve tank. We can't disconnect the lower end of the clutch cable until we first disconnect the upper end. Now we will disconnect the ends of the clutch cable. There is a certain sequence that you must follow to disconnect the cable ends. This sequence may seem overly complicated, but it is necessary to gain the slack required to disconnect the cable ends. Begin by loosening the lock nut at the upper cable end and thread it as far away from the lever mount as it'll go. Then turn the barrel adjuster so that it moves into the lever mount. Move it towards the lever mount as far as it'll go. This will maximize cable slack at the upper end of the cable. Then loosen the lock nuts at the lower end of the clutch cable with two 12mm open-ended wrenches and rotate the lock nuts until they move as far up the threads as possible. This maximizes slack at the lower end of the cable. Then at the upper end of the clutch cable, line up the slots on the lock nut and barrel adjuster with the slot on the lever mount so that the cable can be removed. Line up the cable with the slot under the lever so that the cable can be removed from the lever. This is what the barrel adjuster looks like if you thread it out of the lever mount, but you don't need to thread it out of the lever mount. This is for visual reference only. At the bottom end of the clutch cable, move the dust cover out of the way and remove the lower end of the clutch cable from the bracket. Be aware that this can be very difficult if you do not remove the cable end in a certain way. To do this, move the bracket towards the engine as you try to push the cable end out of the bracket. Then, remove the lower nut from its threads. Then, pull the cable out of its mounting bracket. We must also remove the second nut from the threads to pull the cable through the bracket on the coolant reserve tank. Move the clutch cable up through the bracket on the coolant reserve tank. Position the nuts so that they move through the bracket. You may want to tuck the clutch cable under the gas tank to get it out of the way. Now we're ready to remove the reserve tank mounting bolts. Each bolt has a washer, but the longer bolt has a very long spacer as well. As you can see, some of the black material congregated into the reserve tank. Sometimes the reserve tank gasket comes out with the cap, other times it stays on the tank. If the gasket comes off, simply push it back into the cap. Wash the reserve tank thoroughly. Make sure that there's no gunk resting at the bottom. The first time I washed the tank, I observed a white solid at the bottom of the tank. I'm not sure if this was caused by old coolant or some kind of damage to the system, or corrosion. Make sure that the water flows freely through the nipples and that they aren't clogged. Now we will remove the driver's seat. Remove the seat by loosening 2 hex bolts, one on each side of the bike. Each bolt has a spacer. Sometimes the spacer will fall out, other times it will stay lodged in its hole. As you can see, this spacer may be difficult to remove without first removing the seat. This second spacer came out with its bolt. To remove the seat, pull it straight back to disengage the hooks from their slots, then lift the seat straight up. Now we will remove the gas tank. The service manual doesn't say to remove the gas tank, but I highly recommend that you do. If you've performed this valve adjustment many times, then you might feel comfortable doing it without removing the gas tank. But if you're performing the valve adjustment for the first time, I think it would be virtually impossible, because you'd have to access many of the lifters without actually being able to see them. Begin by removing the two mounting bolts. Notice the direction arrow on the washer bracket. Place a 2x2 by 6 inch block under the gas tank to allow easy access to the fuel gauge, electrical wire and hoses. Don't worry about damaging the gas tank when lifting it up this way. The tank has two pieces which are designed to rotate on circular dampers. These are the dampers. Now disconnect the fuel gauge wire. Push the hook inwards and separate the connectors. Then remove the fuel hose and vacuum hose from the fuel tap. As you can see, it's difficult to reach the hoses without lifting the gas tank. Use pliers to remove the clamp on the fuel hose. The clamp on the vacuum hose is difficult to remove, difficult to install, and generally worthless, so you may want to replace it with a better one. The clamp doesn't open when the ends are pushed together, so the best way to remove it is to simply push it off. Place a rag or paper towel under the fuel hose because some fuel will drip during removal. Remove the fuel hose from the fuel tap. And remove the vacuum hose. Take off the clamps on the hoses on the front left part of the gas tank. If your motorcycle is made for a state other than California, then your bike may only have one or two of these hoses, not three. Be aware that the service manual does not mention these hoses in the fuel tank removal section, even though the hoses must be disconnected to remove the gas tank. It is probably best to leave the clamps on the hoses so that they don't turn up missing. After removing the clamps, gently coax the hoses off their nipples with a flathead screwdriver. Don't damage the hoses or nipples with the screwdriver. Be prepared for some gasoline to spurt out when the hoses are removed because of pressure in the tank. Lift the front fairing pieces off the gas tank. The front fairing pieces may fall back into place when you attempt to remove the gas tank. Gently remove the gas tank, making sure that no wires or hoses are hung up on the motorcycle as you remove it. Don't tilt the gas tank too far forward, or else fuel will pour out of the tap, even when it's not on the drain mode. Be sure to store the tank in a well-ventilated area, just in case fuel does evaporate from the tap. Pressurized gas vapor is extremely explosive. Don't smoke or expose the gas tank to any potential ignition source. Don't set the gas tank directly on its fuel tap, or else you may damage the tap. You can use 2 tissue boxes to keep the fuel tank off the ground. As you can see, the fuel tap clears the ground when the 2 tissue boxes are positioned on the side edges of the gas tank. Before removing the radiator, we'll disconnect the battery. This prevents the radiator fan or engine from starting, which could obviously cause severe injury while working near these parts. Be aware that if the radiator fan is connected to the battery, it can start even when the ignition key is in the off position. Before disconnecting the battery, be sure that the ignition switch is in the off position. To disconnect the battery, we must first remove the battery cover. Pull the circuit relay off its tab away from the cover, then remove the Phillips screw. Pull this tab and this tab through their slots. You may have to angle the cover up to move the tabs through. Now we'll go to the other side of the bike. Move the battery cover aside. You can't move it far because the diodes on the top of the cover are attached. You can insert the battery cover in this opening to keep it out of the way. Remove the Phillips bolt on the negative battery terminal. Then tuck the cable under the frame so it can't touch the battery. Reinstall the Phillips screw so that you don't lose it. To protect the battery from dust and liquid, reinstall the cover. Push the tabs on the cover through the slots on the battery holder. Remember to angle the cover. Reinstall the Phillips screw so you don't lose it. And we might as well place the circuit relay on its tab so that we remember its original location. Reinstall the seat so that the battery and electrical wires are not exposed during the entire valve adjustment. Put the hooks into these slots and push the seat forward to lock it into position. You don't need to install the hex bolts right now. We're just using the seat as a temporary cover for the battery while we perform the valve inspection. Now we'll remove the radiator. First, disconnect the wire leading to the fan. As you can see, this is the wire that leads to the fan. Push the hook inwards and separate the connectors. You should probably use two hands. I'm using one hand to keep the other out of the way of the camera. Of course, always pull these wires out by the connectors and not by the wires. Then disconnect the wire at the left side of the bike. Push up on the bottom of the connector to release the hook from its tab, then remove the connector. As you can see, pressing up on the connector lowers the hook, allowing the connector to be released. Now we'll remove the coolant hose on the left side of the radiator. I suggest keeping the clamp around the hose so it doesn't get lost. These hoses tend to stick tightly on the radiator, so use a flathead screwdriver to gently coax it off. Be careful not to damage the hose or radiator. You only need to use the screwdriver to get removal started, then pull the hose off by hand. Follow the same procedure to remove the hose on the right side of the bike. After moving the clamp out of the way, tighten it slightly so that it won't fall off the hose. In order to remove the radiator, we must first remove the horn and the radiator fairing mounting bracket. First, disconnect the two wires. Remember to take a picture so you know which wire goes where. Then pull the wires out of their holder. Then move the wires away. Now we'll remove the 4 radiator mounting bolts. The two upper radiator mounting bolts also hold the radiator fairing bracket in place. This first bolt not only holds up the radiator and radiator fairing mounting bracket, but also the horn. I'm sorry it's taking so long to remove these bolts. I would use an electric driver, but it's hard to fit the driver in this area and get a good camera angle at the same time. The horn is now removed. Now we'll remove the second bolt. After removing this bolt, we'll be able to remove the radiator fairing mounting bracket. This concludes part 1 of how to inspect and adjust valve clearance on a 2011 Ninja 250. Go to the following link to begin part 2 of this video.